The night my wife died. My children handed me a suitcase and said the owner's suite belonged to them now. The cracked key she left me had no room number, only a snowflake cut into the brass. At midnight, the service elevator accepted it and descended below the cellar. A warm door waited behind a wall of ice. I appreciate you choosing to spend your time here with me. One small thing before we start. Leave me a comment and let me know. Have you ever watched someone in your family change into a person you barely recognized? Yes or no? I read every one. A quick note, some details in this story are dramatized to deepen the emotional impact. The lesson at its core is what truly matters. The night my wife died. My children packed my suitcase before her body was cold and handed me a cracked key to nowhere. I was sitting on the edge of our bed. The bed I had built from reclaimed oak the summer we opened the lodge, when the door swung open without a knock. Snow fell past the master suite windows in slow, heavy curtains, and the Blue Ridge Mountains were nothing but black shapes against a blacker sky. Lorraine's perfume still clung to the pillow beside me. The paramedics had taken her 40 minutes ago. I could still feel the warmth where she had been. My son walked in first. Griffin Caldwell, 41 years old, a luxury hospitality consultant who had never driven a nail or mixed a batch of concrete in his life, stepped into the room already wearing a pressed blazer over his funeral shirt. Behind him came my daughter, Nadine Caldwell, 42, a resort real estate broker with a talent for appraising sentiment out of any room. Carried a copper key pinched between two manicured fingers, like something she had found on the floor and was not sure she wanted to touch. Griffin set a packed suitcase at my feet. "The suite has the best view of the valley," he said. "Simone and I will need it for investor meetings." "You understand, Dad." I looked at my son. I looked at the suitcase. I looked at the pillow where my wife of 47 years had taken her last breath less than an hour ago. "And this," Nadine said, dropping the key onto the nightstand like loose change. "Mom wanted you to have it. Let me tell you something about silence. When a man who built every beam in a building chooses not to speak, it is not because he has nothing to say. It is because he understands that certain words, once released, cannot be taken back. And I was not ready to let my children hear the words forming behind my teeth." I picked up the key. A tiny snowflake was etched into the copper, half obscured by a hairline fracture that ran through the metal like a scar. No room number, no label, just cold metal, and a symbol I had never seen my wife use. Griffin was already talking about the future. Their future. He leaned against the doorframe the way a man leans against something he believes he owns, and told me the historic stone wall in the main lobby would come down at 8 in the morning. "The excavator's already on the access road," he said. I could hear it through the walls, that distant diesel rumble of heavy equipment being unloaded in the dark. "By tomorrow afternoon, that old wall will be a parking foundation. Mom was too sentimental to modernize. We won't make that mistake. 40 years ago, I carried Lorraine across the threshold of this lodge when it had no heat, no guests, and no future. I poured the concrete for that stone wall with my own hands the winter our son was born, working in freezing air while she handed me coffee through the window and told me the wall was going to outlast both of us. Now he was scheduling its demolition before his mother's pillow had gone cold. Nadine touched my shoulder the way you touch a piece of furniture you are about to move. "There's a nice inn at the bottom of the mountain. Dad, we can arrange a small monthly allowance once things settle. To keep up appearances." Have you ever watched your own child look through you as though you were already gone? Not with cruelty, exactly. With something worse, efficiency. I picked up the suitcase. I did not argue. I did not shout. I walked out of the master's suite I had designed on a drafting table in 1983, down the corridor I had paneled with hand-cut cedar, past the photographs of a family that no longer existed in any form I recognized. And then I stopped. The old service elevator at the end of the east wing had a brass panel beside its doors that had been sealed shut for as long as anyone could remember. Staff walked past it every day without a second glance. I had walked past it 10,000 times myself. But tonight I was holding a key with a snowflake on it, and the brass panel had a slot I had never examined closely, shaped like a snowflake with a fracture line running through it. I pressed the key into the slot. The panel clicked. The steel doors slid open, releasing a breath of warm air that smelled of wet stone and deep earth, rising from a shaft that descended into darkness, a floor that existed on no blueprint I had ever drawn. I stepped inside and pressed the only button. I rode that elevator down into warm darkness, and what I found there changed everything. But that story will keep. First, I need to tell you about the morning they buried my wife's memory in white lilies and corporate handshakes. Because that was the morning I understood exactly what my children had become. The memorial filled the main lobby with people who had loved Lorraine and people who had loved what Lorraine built. I could tell the difference by watching their hands. The ones who loved her held tissues. The ones who loved her empire held business cards. Simone Caldwell, 40 years old, Griffin's wife and a self-styled brand consultant who had never earned a dollar she did not marry into, drifted through the crowd with her phone raised like a weapon. I watched her photograph the hand-carved mahogany sideboard Lorraine had restored the summer of our 30th anniversary. She angled for the maker's mark. She was not mourning. She was appraising. Through the lobby windows I could see Brent Prescott, 44. Nadine's husband and a speculative vacation rental investor with a smooth voice and a gift for disguising losses as expansion costs, pacing the parking lot with his phone pressed to his ear. He was talking about staffing cuts. The eulogies had not finished, and he was already calculating how many employees he could eliminate by the end of the quarter. Grief, I have learned, is a room you enter alone. Greed is the crowd that rushes in behind you and starts measuring the walls. I sat in the corner with a cup of coffee I could not taste, watching white lilies bank the stone fireplace Lorraine and I had built together from river rock we hauled by hand. The smell of the flowers mixed with furniture polish and the cold mountain air leaking through a cracked window nobody had bothered to fix. My children were already too busy dividing the future to maintain the present. Then a warm hand closed around my cold one. Stella Garrett, 58. The lodge's general manager for 22 years, and the only person in the building who still called me sir. Sat beside me without a word. She held my hand through 2 more eulogies before she leaned close and whispered what she had come to say. They're bringing heavy equipment up the access road, sir. They mean to take the stone wall down tomorrow morning. She said it the way a nurse delivers a terminal diagnosis. Quiet, precise, already grieving for what cannot be saved. I squeezed her hand once and said nothing, because by then I already knew something Stella did not. 2 days later, the estate lawyer read Lorraine's will in the wood-paneled conference room on the 2nd floor. Griffin sat at the head of the table, a position no one had offered him. Nadine sat to his right, her hands folded, her face arranged into an expression of solemn expectation. Simone had her phone face down on the table, screen still glowing. Brent leaned back with his arms crossed, already bored by the formalities standing between him and the money. The lawyer read in a dry monotone that made $42 million sound like a grocery list. The resort operation, the brand, the satellite properties, the company accounts, all of it. Split evenly between Griffin and Nadine, 50-50. 21 million each. Then he reached the final clause. To my husband Vernon, the lawyer read, adjusting his glasses. I confirm he has already received his full provision, as we agreed, through the item currently in his possession. The room went quiet. Griffin looked at me, then at the cracked copper key sitting on the table where I had placed it. He leaned back and laughed. That key probably opens the maintenance shed out back, he said. At least you'll have somewhere dry to sleep. Dad, I want you to understand something before we go any further. I did not stay silent because I was weak. I stayed silent because 40 years of building had taught me the difference between a load-bearing wall and a facade. My children had just inherited a facade. They did not know it yet. Nadine softened her voice into that rehearsed sympathy she used on clients. Don't worry, Dad. We talked about it. We can set up a small monthly amount. Just enough to keep things dignified for everyone. Griffin slid the will across the polished table toward me, still grinning like a boy who had won a game he did not realize he was losing. I picked up the cracked key and turned it over in my palm, feeling the snowflake etching rough against my thumb. They thought it opened nothing, but I had already stood in the room it unlocked. And what I found down there was about to rewrite everything they believed they had just inherited. That night, after Griffin's laughter had faded and the will had been folded away, I waited. I sat in the dark hallway of the East Wing until every light on the upper floors went out, until the last footstep overhead fell silent. Then I walked back to the service elevator with the cracked key warm in my fist. The elevator dropped past the wine cellar and kept going. When the doors opened, the air hit me like a wall of January. The corridor ahead was carved from raw stone, and every surface was glazed in frost. Ice crystals clung to overhead pipes and glinted under a single emergency bulb that had no business still working this far underground. My boots cracked through the frozen skin on the floor with each step, the sound echoing off walls that had not heard a human voice in years. But something was wrong with the cold. It was thinning. With every step forward, the temperature climbed. By the time I reached the end of the corridor, the frost on the walls had given way to condensation, and the air tasted of warm minerals and deep earth. At the far end stood a steel door, heavy as a bank vault, and when I pressed my palm flat against it, the metal was warm. Not residual heat, not insulation, living warmth, the kind that comes from the earth itself. I knew that warmth. I had designed the geothermal feed that produced it. 40 years ago, when Lorraine and I were running the lodge on savings and stubbornness, I routed those pipes myself, calculated the bore depth, sealed the junctions with my own hands. That system was supposed to heat the main building. It did. But someone had kept a branch line running down here, feeding warmth into a room that did not exist on any schematic I had ever filed. Lorraine. She had kept my geothermal feed alive in a place I never knew about for decades, in secret. There is a kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. The cold of walking through a building your hands built and knowing your own children consider you a stranger in it. But there is also a kind of warmth that has nothing to do with geothermal engineering. The warmth of discovering that your wife, even in death, had been keeping something alive for you. The key turned without resistance, as though the lock had been waiting. The door swung inward and I stepped into a room I had not seen in 4 decades. Our room. The original room Lorraine and I had shared when the lodge was bankrupt and empty. When we had 0 guests and $0 and nothing but a mountain we refused to give up. The iron bed was still there, pushed against the far wall. The blue wool bedspread her mother had given us the winter we could not afford heating oil was still tucked across the mattress. Faded, but clean. Yellowed engineering blueprints were tacked to the stone walls with rusted pins. A wooden desk sat beneath them, and on the desk, a locked filing cabinet engraved with a snowflake. She had kept this room the way a cathedral keeps its altar. Untouched. Sacred. A place where the truth of what we built together could never be rewritten by the people who came after us. I sat on the edge of that iron bed and I wept. Not for myself, for the woman who had loved me enough to preserve a hidden room where our beginning could never be demolished. Not by time, not by greed, not by the children we had raised wrong. The bedspread still carried a ghost of her perfume. Trapped in wool fibers for 40 years, and I pressed my face into it and breathed her in one more time. Above the iron headboard, in her elegant slanting script, she had written 6 words directly on the plaster. The mountain remembers who built it. I do not know how long I sat there. Long enough for the tears to dry. Long enough for grief to cool into something harder, something with edges. Then I stood, crossed to the desk, and looked at the filing cabinet. The snowflake engraving matched the key exactly. I slid the key in and pulled the top drawer open. Inside was not money, not a letter, not a photograph. It was a stack of original land deeds thick as a Bible, each one bearing Lorraine's signature and the seal of the county recorder. Clipped to the front page, in her handwriting, was a single clause. It mentioned the stone wall, the same wall my son had scheduled for demolition. I looked at the clock on the desk. It read 1:03 a.m. In less than 7 hours, my son would swing an excavator into that wall. And according to this clause, it would be the last mistake he ever made as a property owner. I sat down under the lamp and began to read. Have you ever held a piece of paper that weighed more than everything you thought you had lost? The first deed was the water rights, hot spring access, aquifer control. All riparian claims on the eastern face of the mountain registered in my name, countersigned by Lorraine, notarized and sealed by the county recorder. I turned to the next page. Land title. Every acre the lodge sat on, every acre surrounding it. The ridge line, the forest buffer, the drainage basin feeding the valley below, all of it mine. Not the resorts, not the companies. Mine. The third document was the mountain access road, the only paved route connecting the lodge to the state highway. I had graded that road myself the summer of 1984, with a rented bulldozer and a case of cheap beer. Lorraine had flagged the curves while I cut the switchbacks. The deed was in my name because I had built it before the resort was even incorporated. The fourth was the geothermal patent portfolio. Every heating system, every bore specification, every thermal recovery design I had engineered over 4 decades. 12 patents in total, all assigned to me personally, never transferred to the company. I need you to understand what my wife did. She did not simply hide money. She separated the soul of an empire from its skin and left the skin to the wolves. My children had celebrated inheriting the brand, the bookings, the logo on the sign. But the land beneath the building, the water flowing through its pipes, the road their guests drove in on, and the heat keeping them warm at night, none of it belonged to them. It never had. $210 million. That was the conservative appraisal value Lorraine had noted in the margin of the land deed in her careful blue ink. The operational brand my children had split between them was worth a fraction of that. They were tenants in an empire they believed they owned, paying rent they did not know they owed, to a landlord they had just evicted. I spread the deeds across the desk and stared at them under the amber light. The geothermal warmth pulsed through the chamber walls, carrying that faint sulfur smell of deep earth. Above me, through layers of stone and timber. My son slept in the master suite. He had no idea he was sleeping on borrowed ground. Then I found the last document. It was clipped to the back of the land deed, written in Lorraine's hand, dated 5 years before her death. A heritage preservation clause, filed with the county and embedded in the conservation trust she had created, without telling me. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood. The clause was specific. If the historic stone wall in the main lobby, the original load-bearing wall, poured by hand in the winter of 1982, registered as a heritage structure under the Pennsylvania Conservation Act, was deliberately destroyed. The company all exploitation rights to the water, land, geothermal systems, and access road would automatically transfer to the Conservation Trust. My trust. No court order required, no waiting period. Instantaneous and irrevocable. 7 hours. That was all that stood between my children's arrogance and their absolute ruin. I picked up the handwritten note Lorraine had clipped to the clause. Her words were steady, but I could see where the pen had pressed harder in places. the way it always did when she was fighting back emotion. "If they love what we built, they will protect it," she had written. "If they tear it down, this clause will protect you. I am sorry I had to plan for the worst, my love, but I watched them become strangers, and I could not leave you undefended." 5 years. 5 years before the cancer took her voice. Lorraine had seen exactly what our children were becoming. She had watched them sharpen into something unrecognizable, and she had done the only thing a structural engineer's wife would think to do. She built a wall around me. A legal wall. Invisible. Load-bearing. Designed to hold when everything else came down. I folded her note and pressed it against my chest. The clock on the chamber wall ticked past 1 in the morning. The lodge timbers creaked and settled above me like an old man shifting in his sleep. Upstairs. My son dreamed of demolition, of glass walls and infinity lounges and a future built on rubble. In less than 7 hours, he would order a machine to destroy the only wall standing between him and total annihilation. And I had to decide whether to stop him or let him swing the hammer himself. I could have stopped it. I want you to know that before I tell you what I did instead. The phone number was written on the back of the last deed, in ink so faded it could have been decades old. I lifted the heavy rotary receiver from the desk and dialed. It rang exactly twice. "Mr. Caldwell." The voice was calm, unsurprised, and already ahead of me. "I have been waiting for this call. Your wife told me it would come within a week of her passing. She was off by 2 days. Cyrus Whitaker, 62. A Heritage Preservation Trust attorney with sharp gray eyes and the patience of a man who had spent decades guarding other people's empires. Had been Lorraine's secret for 5 years. She had found him through a colleague in Philadelphia. She had hired him the month she first noticed Simone cataloging the lodge's antiques and Brent rerouting vendor payments through accounts that did not match any ledger she could find. "The trust is real," Cyrus said. "The deeds are binding, and the preservation clause is self-executing." I gripped the receiver and listened as he laid it out in the steady language of a man who builds cases the way I build foundations, one verified fact at a time. Lorraine had structured everything over 5 years of quiet, meticulous legal work. The Conservation Trust was filed, funded, and sealed. The clause was embedded in the county records. It required no court order, no injunction, no judge's signature. "The moment that wall comes down," Cyrus said, "every exploitation right, water, land, road access, geothermal, reverts to your trust automatically. Their own demolition crew becomes your legal witness." The clause was self-executing, but Cyrus still had to file the triggering affidavit with the county within 24 hours, which is exactly why we needed everything on camera. I closed my eyes. The clock on the chamber wall ticked past 2 in the morning. "I can stop it," I said. "I can walk upstairs right now and show my son the deeds." The line went quiet for 3 seconds. Then Cyrus spoke with the careful precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment. "Do not stop the excavator. Mr. Caldwell, if you intervene now, they will hire lawyers, claim undue influence, drag this through probate for years. Your children have resources, and they have spite. But if they destroy that wall with their own hands, in front of their own cameras, they write their own verdict. No appeals, no ambiguity. Self-executing means self-convicting. You might think a father would run upstairs and stop it. You might think love would override strategy. But I had spent 40 years pouring foundations, and I knew that a structure built on rot will collapse whether you intervene or not. The only question is whether it falls on your terms or theirs." I hung up the phone. The chamber was silent except for the geothermal hum in the walls and the ticking of the clock. I sat on the edge of the iron bed where Lorraine and I had slept when we were young and broke and fearless. And I held the deeds against my chest, the way you hold a child you are about to send into a storm. I could save the wall, or I could save myself. Lorraine had known I could not do both. She had made the choice for me 5 years ago, when she sat across from Cyrus Whitaker in his Philadelphia office and told him that her children were going to tear down everything she loved, and that the only way to stop them was to let them do it. What kind of man lets his own son walk into a trap he could prevent? The same kind of man who poured concrete in freezing air the winter his son was born, who sold his truck to keep the lodge running, who never once asked for credit or recognition or even a room with a view. A man who had already given everything once and understood that some lessons cannot be taught. They can only be detonated. I touched the words on the plaster one last time. The mountain remembers who built it. Then I folded the deeds into my coat pocket, turned off the lamp, and rode the elevator up through darkness into the gray light of dawn. The lobby smelled of diesel. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the excavator already positioned against the base of the stone wall, its steel arm raised against the mountain sky like a fist. My son stood beside it in a hard hat, gesturing to a camera crew he had invited to document what he believed was the beginning of his legacy. The engine growled. The first birds of morning scattered from the ridgeline. I stood in the shadows of the lobby and watched my son prepare to destroy the last thing I had built with my own hands. In less than 2 hours, he would swing that arm, and he would sign his own eviction notice with a wrecking ball. The first stone cracked at exactly 8:07 a.m. I know because I was counting the seconds since my son gave the signal. Griffin stood in the courtyard in a hard hat he did not need, surrounded by people he wanted to impress. He had roped off a viewing area for 2 potential investors in cashmere coats and a handful of regional journalists with cameras already rolling. This was not a renovation. It was a performance. He had turned the destruction of the wall I poured with my own hands into a media event, complete with a thumbs up to the excavator operator and a speech he had clearly rehearsed in the mirror. "This wall has been holding back progress for a century," Griffin said, his voice pitched for the cameras. "Today we tear down the past and build the future." The steel arm swung. The first impact sent a shudder through the entire building. I felt it in the soles of my boots. Standing behind the lobby windows with a cup of coffee I had not taken a single sip from, limestone fragments exploded outward across the courtyard, a cloud of pale dust rising into the mountain air and drifting across the roped-off area. The journalists shielded their cameras. The investors stepped back. Griffin did not flinch. He was too busy smiling. Nadine stood beside one of the investors, already selling the vision. "By next season, you'll be standing in a glass-walled infinity lounge right where that rubble is," she said, gesturing at the disintegrating wall as though it were an inconvenience rather than a monument. "I built that wall in the winter of 1982 with my bare hands and a concrete mixer I had borrowed from a neighbor who never asked for it back. The rain held the forms while I poured. Our son was 3 weeks old, sleeping in a car seat on the lobby floor because we could not afford a babysitter and could not afford to stop working. Every stone in that wall carried the memory of a young couple who had nothing except a mountain and the stubborn belief that they could make it into something worth keeping. Now a machine was undoing 40 years of that work in 40 minutes. And I was letting it happen. Stella appeared beside me. She gripped my arm and leaned close, her voice barely audible above the grinding of hydraulics and the crack of splitting stone. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "There's still time." I shook my head once. "There isn't. There never was. Lorraine made sure of that." Stella looked at me for a long moment, then released my arm and walked away without another word. She understood. Not the details, not the clause, or the trust, or the deeds folded against my ribs inside my coat. But she understood that whatever was happening, I had already made my peace with it. The wall came down in sections. Each impact sent vibrations through the lobby floor, up through my legs, into my chest. I felt every stone break. I did not look away. Every strike of that steel arm was a legal signature my children could never take back. A time-stamped, publicly witnessed, camera-documented act that no lawyer on earth could undo. You want to know what it looks like when a man watches his children destroy themselves? It looks like nothing. It looks like a 73-year-old man standing very still behind a window, holding a cup of cold coffee he will never drink, with a face so empty it could be mistaken for peace. The last section fell at 8:41 a.m. Griffin popped a bottle of champagne. The cork sailed over the rubble and landed somewhere in the dust. Nadine held up her phone, filming a live video with a caption I would later learn read, "New Era." The investors clapped politely. The journalists got their footage. Then Griffin came inside. He walked straight to me, still wearing the hard hat, champagne flute in one hand, limestone dust on his blazer. He expected something. Anger, maybe? Tears? Some kind of reaction he could dismiss or absorb or weaponize. Instead, he found nothing. I looked at my son the way you look at a clock, noting the time, nothing more. "You can thank me later." "Dad," he said. "Mom would have come around eventually." I set the coffee cup on the windowsill. I turned toward the east wing. I did not look back. My phone buzzed once in my pocket as I walked. I pulled it out and read the message without breaking stride. Cyrus Whitaker. 3 sentences. Clause activated. Timestamp confirmed via 3 news feeds. The trust is now sole rights holder. I deleted the message and kept walking. Behind me, my son was pouring champagne for men who would soon discover they were toasting on borrowed ground. While Griffin poured champagne over rubble and pitched infinity lounges to investors who would never write a check. Something was happening 2 floors below that would matter far more than anything said in that courtyard. Stella Garrett had survived 22 years at the lodge by knowing which closets held skeletons. But she had never opened the one behind the filing cabinets in the basement archive. She went down there looking for insurance paperwork. The demolition had triggered a standard claim process. Structural alteration to a heritage-listed building required documentation. And Stella was the kind of manager who filed things properly even when her employers did not deserve the effort. She pulled the water-stained cabinet away from the back wall. And behind it, wedged into a gap between the stone foundation and the drywall, she found a sealed manila folder. The handwriting on the front was Lorraine's. Stella recognized the elegant, slanting script immediately. The stamp read, "Heritage Preservation, Caldwell Mountain Lodge." Inside were copies of the conservation easement, the clause trigger conditions, and a handwritten note dated 2 years before Lorraine died. Stella read the note standing in the dim archive light, dust motes drifting around her, and her hands went numb. "If you're finding this, the wall is already gone," Lorraine had written. "Find Vernon. He'll know what to do." Have you ever held a piece of paper that could ruin someone's life and felt your hands go numb? Not from fear, but from the weight of knowing you have to decide what to do with it. Stella stood in that basement for 10 minutes, reading and rereading, understanding piece by piece what Lorraine had built and what Griffin had just destroyed. Then she closed the folder, tucked it under her arm, and climbed the stairs to the executive office. Griffin was behind the desk reviewing renovation bids, champagne flute still half full beside his laptop. The office smelled of celebration and limestone dust. He did not look up when Stella entered. "Griffin," she said, "this clause is tied to a conservation trust. If I'm reading it right, demolishing that wall just triggered a legal transfer of—" "Stop." He looked up. His face flushed from champagne and adrenaline and the particular arrogance of a man who had just torn something down and called it progress. "You're the hotel manager, Stella, not a lawyer. Drop it. This is serious. The heritage designation—" His fist hit the desk. The champagne flute rattled. "I said drop it, or I'll find someone who knows their place." Stella stood very still. She had managed this lodge through blizzards that knocked out power for 3 days, through a kitchen fire that nearly took the east wing, through 2 lawsuits and a health inspection that required rebuilding the entire water filtration system in 72 hours. She had done all of it without raising her voice, without asking for recognition, without once reminding anyone that Lorraine had hired her personally and trusted her with every operational decision for over 2 decades. 22 years. Griffin had just reduced all of it to a threat delivered between sips of champagne.
"And if I hear you've shown that folder to anyone,"
Griffin said, leaning forward. "Anyone at all, you're done. 22 years means nothing to me." Stella left the office. Her hands were shaking, but her spine was not. She walked down the service corridor, her heels clicking on the tile in a rhythm she had walked 10,000 times. She passed the staff break room where the coffee was always stale and the schedules were always posted a day late. She passed the linen closet and the maintenance entrance and the back stairwell that led to the loading dock. She did not return the folder to the archive. Instead, she stopped in the corridor, looked both ways, and tucked the documents inside her jacket, pressing them flat against her ribs where no one would see them. She pulled out her phone and began typing a text to me. Then she stopped, deleted it, put the phone away. Lorraine had hired her. Lorraine had trusted her. And Lorraine's son had just told her that trust meant nothing. Some messages are too important for a screen. She found me on the East Terrace, sitting alone, staring at the pile of rubble that had been my wall an hour ago. She did not say a word. She walked over, set the manila folder on my knee, and stood there with her arms crossed, waiting. I looked down. The first page was in Lorraine's handwriting. It was addressed to me, and the date at the top told me my wife had written it while she was still strong enough to hold a pen. 2 years before the cancer took that from her, too. I read Lorraine's note on the terrace, with Stella standing guard beside me. Then I folded it into my coat with the rest of the documents and told her I needed to disappear for a while. She nodded once, asked no questions, and went back inside. Some people understand silence better than conversation. The Pine Ridge Inn smelled like pine soap and someone else's life. For the first time in 47 years, I did not have a key to my own home. I checked in at the front desk, paying cash. The clerk was a college kid who did not recognize me and did not care. I asked for a ground floor room. They gave me room, 11 pine-paneled walls, a window that did not open all the way, a radiator that clicked like a metronome with arthritis. Lorraine and I had spent our wedding night at this inn, in room 6, 47 years ago. Everything had doubled in price and halved in meaning since then. I set my suitcase on the thin bedspread and got to work. The loose floorboard under the radiator came up easily. The wood was soft from decades of steam. I placed the lockbox underneath, sealed with the deeds, the patents, the water rights, and Lorraine's preservation documents. Then I pressed the board back down and positioned the radiator over it. Nobody would look. Nobody looks at floors in cheap motels. Then I sat on the bed and rehearsed. Let me tell you something about pride. It is a luxury. And that night, in a 12 by 14 room with a vending machine coffee cooling on the nightstand, I could not afford luxuries. The role I needed to play was specific, broken father, compliant elder, a man too defeated to cause trouble. I practiced the slump in my shoulders. I practiced the tremor in my voice. I practiced looking at my hands the way old men look at their hands when they have accepted that the world no longer needs them. I am 73 years old. I have built structures that will outlast my grandchildren. And I was sitting in a motel room rehearsing weakness like an actor preparing for opening night. The next morning, Nadine's car crunched onto the gravel parking lot at 9:15. I heard the engine before I saw her. She came to the door in resort-branded activewear, carrying a manila envelope, her hair blown straight. Her smile rehearsed with the same precision I had rehearsed my defeat before she knocked. I set my phone on the nightstand, screen down, voice recorder running. "We want you comfortable, Dad," Nadine said. sitting on the room's only chair and crossing her legs as though she were in a boardroom. She slid the envelope across the bedspread. $1,800 a month. And all you have to do is sign this waiver. Griffin and I agreed. Family takes care of family. I picked up the envelope with hands I made tremble. I opened it slowly, squinting at the print the way a confused old man squints at something he cannot quite understand. Inside was a legal waiver surrendering all future claims to lodge operations, lodge property, and lodge revenue. In exchange, $1,800 a month, deposited into a designated account, subject to quarterly review. That's very generous. Nadine, I said, letting my voice crack exactly where it needed to. Your mother would have appreciated. Mom's not here anymore, Nadine said. She uncrossed her legs and leaned forward. Let's focus on what's practical. Nadine left the way people leave hospital rooms quickly, already thinking about lunch. Relieved the hard part was over. Her perfume lingered in the small room after her car pulled away, mixing with the pine soap and the old carpet smell until it faded into nothing. She did not know the patient had already been discharged. I locked the door. I stopped the recording. I emailed the audio file to Cyrus with a single line, "Add this to the file." Then I picked up the waiver Nadine had left on the bedspread and read it carefully. Every clause, every subparagraph, every line of fine print. It was thorough. It was well drafted. And it was asking me to surrender rights that had already transferred to my trust the moment the wall came down. She was buying silence I did not need to sell, offering a pittance for a mountain she did not know she had already lost. I set the unsigned waiver on the nightstand and pulled the lockbox out from under the floorboard. The deeds, the patents, the water rights, all still there. But tucked behind them, pressed against the back of the box, was something I had not noticed when I packed it in the dark. A second envelope in Lorraine's handwriting, sealed tight, with 5 words on the front. Open when they come for the road. I did not open Lorraine's second envelope. Not yet. She had labeled it with specific instructions, and I had learned by now that my wife's timing was better than mine, even from the grave. I slid it back into the lockbox and waited for the road to come to them. How much money does it take to make a man forget he does not own what he is selling? 35 million, apparently. I was not in the room when it happened, but Stella told me everything within the hour. Griffin and Brent had scheduled a pitch meeting in the lodge executive office with a banker they had been courting since before the funeral. Dale Fenton, a senior loan officer from First Keystone Regional Bank. Broad shoulders, navy suit, aftershave strong enough to precede him into a room sat across the mahogany desk, while Griffin and Brent presented their vision in glossy binders that smelled of fresh ink and desperation. Griffin sold the dream. 3 luxury condominium developments cascading down the mountainside, each one anchored to the hot spring access and the geothermal heating system that made the lodge unique. He cited appraisal figures for the water rights that made Fenton's eyebrows rise. He painted a picture of a resort empire expanding into something Lorraine had never dared to attempt, as though caution were a character flaw and his mother's decades of careful stewardship had been nothing more than timidity. Brent handled the numbers. He clicked his pen while he walked Fenton through projections and pre-sale interest from investor groups he claimed to have cultivated personally. He was smooth. He was practiced. And he was pledging assets that had belonged to my conservation trust since the morning my son swung an excavator into a stone wall. You are probably wondering why I did not just walk into that meeting and end it right there. Show them the deeds, watch my son's face collapse. But Lorraine did not build a trap that required me to pull the trigger. She built one that pulled itself. Every step my children took forward was a step deeper into the mechanism she had designed. And the beauty of it, the terrible, elegant beauty, was that they were doing it voluntarily. Fenton listened. He asked good questions. And then he said the words that started the clock. The numbers look strong, gentlemen. But $35 million against natural resource rights. We'll need a title verification before the committee signs off.
Griffin's smile held, but I am told his hand tightened on the edge of the desk. After Fenton left, Brent stayed behind to smooth it over.
The office intercom line to the front desk had been left open since the meeting began, and Stella caught the rest of it through the speaker at her station. Low enough that neither man noticed it was still connected. Title verification, that's routine, right, Griffin said. Just paperwork. Routine, Brent assured him, still clicking that pen. I'll have Nadine pull the deed registry copies from the county. We'll have them filed before the appraiser even shows up. Griffin was quiet for a moment. Then, and if Dad's name is on anything, make it go away. I don't care how. Griffin had never read the property deeds. Not once. He had inherited a resort worth tens of millions and had not bothered to check what was actually in the box. He assumed ownership the way children assume the sun. It was simply there. It had always been there, and it would continue to be there, regardless of what they did or failed to do. That afternoon, the bank's appraiser arrived. I watched from the Pine Ridge Inn parking lot, binoculars steady on the lodge grounds, as a man with a clipboard and steel-toed boots walked the property, photographed the demolished wall site, and measured frontage along the access road. He spent 2 hours on the grounds. Then he shook Griffin's hand. Too firm, too long. The handshake of a man selling confidence he did not feel. And told him the full title verification results would be ready within 1 week. 1 week. That was all the time my son had left to live in a world where he believed he was rich. I lowered the binoculars and smiled for the first time in days. That evening, Stella texted me. Nadine had driven to the county records office to pull the deed registry copies Brent had requested. She had asked the clerk for the water rights file, and the clerk had told her something that made her call Griffin from the parking lot with a voice Stella described as thin and confused. The water rights file had been flagged for conservation review since January. 5 months before the wall came down. 2 months before Lorraine died. Nadine did not know what that meant yet, but the clock was ticking, and the appraiser was counting, and somewhere in the county records office a flag my wife had planted was waiting to be found. Nadine's discovery at the county office rattled Griffin enough to call an emergency family meeting that evening. I know this because of what happened next, and because of who was listening outside the door. My granddaughter called me at 11:14 p.m. from a bathroom with the door locked, whispering so fast I had to ask her to say it twice. Wren Caldwell was 16, sharp-eyed, and the only person in the lodge who still had her grandmother's photograph as her phone wallpaper. She had been walking past the study on her way to bed when she heard her parents' voices through the door. Not the polished tones they used in public, but the raw, stripped-down voices people use when they believe no one is listening. She stopped. She listened. And then she did something that would have made Lorraine proud and terrified in equal measure. She pulled out her phone and started recording. Simone's voice came through first, sharp and strategic. Use the girl. Tell him he doesn't sign, he doesn't see Wren again. That's the only leverage we have left. Then Griffin. And if he still won't budge, we get a doctor to question his competency. A 73-year-old man living in a motel, that's not a hard sell. Wren stood in that hallway with her phone trembling in her hands and the taste of something metallic flooding her mouth. She was 16 years old, and she was choosing between her parents and the truth. No child should have to make that choice. No child should have to stand outside a door and hear her mother suggest using her as a weapon against the only grandparent who ever read to her, who taught her to identify mountain birds by their calls, who let her help mix concrete for the garden path the summer she was 9. But Lorraine had raised Wren for the summers. And Lorraine had raised her right. Wren locked herself in the upstairs bathroom. He sat on the tile floor with her back against the tub and called me. "Grandpa, they're going to say you're crazy," she whispered. "Mom said to use me against you. I recorded all of it." My voice broke once. Not from the threat I had expected something like this. It broke from gratitude. From the knowledge that in a house full of people who had forgotten what loyalty meant, a 16-year-old girl had remembered. "Ren, listen to me," I said. "You are braver than anyone in that house. Keep your head down and don't let them know you called me." She sent me the recording before she hung up. I saved it to the same secure folder where Nadine's stipend conversation was already waiting. Then I sat on the edge of the motel bed in the dark and did something I had not done in a very long time. I prayed. Not for victory, for Ren. The next morning I drove 20 miles to Valley View Cafe near Jim Thorpe, where a man I had not seen in 3 years was waiting for me in a corner booth. Murray Holbrook was 75, built like a retired linebacker who had traded the field for engineering drawings. And he had co-designed every geothermal pipe under the mountain with me 4 decades ago. He was a retired geotechnical engineer with hands like shovels and a memory that held grudges the way bedrock holds fossils. When I walked in, he stood up, wrapped me in a hug that cracked something in my upper back, and sat me down in front of a cup of black coffee so strong the spoon nearly stood up in it. The cafe smelled of bacon and maple syrup and the kind of quiet morning that only exists in small mountain towns. A jukebox in the corner played old country nobody was listening to. "I've got every blueprint and a fireproof safe in my garage," Murray said, tapping a canvas tube leaning against the booth. "Your wife called me 3 years ago and told me not to throw them out. Now I know why. 3 years ago. Lorraine had been planning this while she could still drive, still make phone calls, still reach out to the people she trusted and set her pieces in place. Another thread in a web I was only beginning to see the full shape of. "They're going to come after me hard." "Murray," I said. "Competency hearings, lawyers, the whole machine." Murray reached across the table and gripped my hand with a calloused palm that had once held drill casings steady in 100-degree boreholes. "Then they'll have to go through a 75-year-old geotechnical engineer who remembers every pipe we laid. I'll testify any time, anywhere." I was still holding his hand when my phone lit up. Stella. 2 messages. The first: "Griffin just fired me, effective immediately. Security escorted me out with a box." The second: "I took copies of everything in the personnel safe before they changed the locks. Where do you want me?" I told Stella to meet me at Pine Ridge Inn. She arrived within the hour, carrying a banker's box and the expression of a woman who had just walked out of a burning building and brought the fire extinguisher with her. We spread the personnel safe copies across my motel bed, and I thanked her in a way I hope she understood. Then I called Cyrus. The next morning, Cyrus Whitaker walked into the Carbon County Recorder's office at 9:01 a.m. with a leather briefcase and filed 6 documents that would erase my children's future in alphabetical order. He called me at 9:47. "Filed and stamped," he said. 6 documents, all indexed. As of this moment, you are the sole registered owner of every asset beneath, above, and leading to that mountain." "And the resort itself?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "A brand with no land under it, no water in it, and no road to reach it," Cyrus said. "Your children own a name on a sign." The county clerk stamped each document with blue ink and went back to her coffee. She did not know she was recording the end of a family empire. She did not know the effective date on every filing matched the morning my son had swung an excavator into a stone wall and popped champagne over the rubble. She stamped and filed and moved on to the next person in line. The way the world processes catastrophe, one form at a time. 6 documents. That is all it took. 6 pieces of paper, each one stamped by a clerk who forgot about them before the ink was dry. And my children's empire became a sandcastle at high tide. The water rights, the land deeds, the mountain access road, the geothermal patents, the conservation easement, the trust registration, all indexed under my name, all triggered by the demolition, all irrevocable. I sat on the edge of the motel bed and held the phone against my chest after Cyrus hung up. The radiator clicked.
The mountain outside the window was the same mountain it had been yesterday. But everything beneath it, on top of it, and leading to it, was now legally mine. That afternoon, the cracks at the lodge began to show. Dale Fenton called Griffin from the bank. Stella's friend on the front desk staff texted me the details within minutes. The banker needed supplemental documentation, original land surveys, water rights certificates, the road easement. Without them, the title chain had gaps too wide for the loan committee to ignore. Griffin told Brent to handle it. Brent searched the lodge files and found chaos. Half the administrative records had walked out the door with Stella, and the other half were incomplete. He told Griffin they needed to pull duplicates from the county. The filing cabinets are a mess since Stella left, Brent said. I'll get Nadine to run to the county office again. Griffin poured himself a scotch. The ice clinked in the glass like a countdown he could not hear. He leaned back in the leather chair behind the executive desk and waved his hand as though the missing documents were a moth he could shoo away. We own a mountain. Brent. Mountains don't just disappear from a deed. The paperwork will sort itself out. What do you call a man who owns a brand, but not the ground it stands on, not the water it pipes, and not the road his guests drive in on? You call him a tenant who does not know it yet. And if it doesn't, Brent said quietly. Griffin took a long sip of scotch expensive, wasted on a man who could not taste the irony. Then we find a bank that doesn't need a permission slip to lend money. Now stop panicking. You sound like my father. He said it as an insult. He had no idea it was a confession. Brent said nothing more. He left the executive office and closed the door behind him. He told an investigator months later what happened that night. And I believed him because the timeline matched everything else. That night, in the dark of his bedroom while Nadine slept beside him, he did something Griffin did not know about. He opened his personal laptop, navigated to the county recorder's office website, and ran a property search on the lodge address. 6 new filings appeared on his screen, all dated the day the wall came down, all registered to an entity he had never heard of, the Caldwell Heritage Conservation Trust. Brent stared at the screen for a long time. The blue light carved shadows into his face. He read each filing twice. He cross-referenced the asset descriptions with the loan proposal he had helped Griffin present to the bank. Then he closed the laptop, set it on the nightstand, and lay in the dark beside his sleeping wife, without saying word. I was about to learn just how many games were being played inside the walls of my lodge. Because the very next day, Simone decided to sell my wife's things. She sold Lorraine's rocking chair for $600 to a woman who planned to paint it white. And that was not even the worst thing she did that afternoon. Simone had transformed the lodge gallery into an auction floor overnight. Lot number tags dangled from hand-carved mantels, wrought iron fixtures, framed mountain photographs Lorraine had taken herself on morning hikes over 30 years. Every piece of furniture Lorraine had collected, restored, or commissioned was lined up like merchandise in a clearance sale. The gallery smelled of old wood and furniture polish, and the particular kind of dust that only settles on things people used to care about. She had hired Roy Ackerman, a leathery regional auctioneer from Stroudsburg who had been selling estate lots for 30 years and knew a provenance problem when he saw one. Roy noticed the brass heritage plaques mounted on several items, small plates indicating the pieces were registered with the State Preservation Office. Ma'am, heritage-tagged items typically require a provenance release before sale, Roy said, holding up a plaque he had found on a wrought iron chandelier. If these are registered, they're registered to a dead woman's taste, Simone said. Pull them off before the buyers see them. We're rebranding, not running a museum. Heritage plaques. Lorraine had mounted each one herself with a Phillips head screwdriver and a level, making sure they were perfectly straight. She had filed the paperwork, corresponded with the state office, driven to Harrisburg twice to confirm the registrations. Simone ripped them off with a butter knife and dropped them in a trash bag. I was not there to see it. But Stella made sure I saw everything. A friend still on the lodge staff sent Stella photographs throughout the afternoon, and Stella forwarded each one to my phone at Pine Ridge Inn. I sat on the edge of the bed with a cup of bitter tea going cold beside me, and watched my wife's legacy sell piece by piece on a 4-inch screen. The rocking chair from our bedroom. The reading lamp she used every night for 40 years. A set of hand-forged fireplace tools we had bought on our anniversary trip to Vermont. She was selling the bones of the house and calling it interior design. I called Cyrus. He listened to the list of items, asked whether the heritage plaques had been removed, and when I confirmed it, his voice took on the quiet precision of a man adding columns in a ledger. Every tagged item sold without trust consent is a separate violation, he said. Let her keep going. Each sale is another count. So I let her keep going. I sat in a motel room and watched through a dead woman's phone tree as my daughter-in-law auctioned off 40 years of carefully curated memory. And I let every gavel strike add another line to the case file Cyrus was building. The final lot was a battered oak trunk from Lorraine's private study. Simone had never opened it. She assumed it was decorative old, scarred, not worth the effort of a key. She was right that it was empty. Lorraine had moved the documents it once held years ago. But the trunk itself was worth something no appraiser could calculate. What is a marriage worth in auction terms? Apparently $400, and a phone bidder who never saw the initials carved inside the lid. LC plus VC. Inside a circle Lorraine had scratched into the oak with a pocket knife the summer we finished the geothermal system. A circle that was supposed to mean forever. Roy's gavel came down. Lot 47, oak storage trunk, circa 1982, phone bid at $400, sold. $400. That evening Stella sent one more photograph. The auction sign-in sheet. Most buyers had paid cash or card. Anonymous. But the phone bidder who purchased the trunk had registered under a company name rather than a personal one. Ridgeline Capital Partners. I did not recognize it. I texted the name to Cyrus. His reply came back in under a minute, which was unusual for a man who chose every word the way a surgeon chooses instruments. That's Brent Prescott's shell company. He bought the trunk himself. I set the phone down and stared at the pine-paneled wall of my motel room. Brent had found the trust filings. Brent had said nothing to Griffin. And now Brent had purchased the one piece of furniture most closely connected to the original deeds, using a company name nobody in the family would recognize. My son-in-law was not panicking. He was positioning. How much money can a man steal from his own family before someone writes it down? Brent's purchase of Lorraine's trunk through Ridgeline Capital confirmed what Cyrus and I suspected my son-in-law was not just complicit in the takeover. He was running his own separate operation underneath it. But the trunk was only the surface. Beneath that purchase lay something far worse, what I learned later. Pieced together from bank records and testimony was that on the same evening I sat staring at the auction sign-in sheet. Brent was sitting alone in the lodge finance office, with the door locked and the hallway lights off. The wire transfer confirmation glowed on his screen, $380,000. Routed from the resort operating fund to Ridgeline Capital Partners. He had labeled it Phase 1 Expansion Site Preparation in the accounting system. A line item generic enough that nobody would question it. He had done this 3 times before. 3 previous transfers to the same shell company, buried across different quarters, totaling over $1 million. The latest withdrawal brought his total take to nearly $1.5 million. He picked up his phone. And I can still hear the words Cyrus later played for me from recovered call logs. Brent told a broker to move the funds into Outer Banks properties. Same structure as the previous transactions. And he was specific about one thing. Do not use the lodge name anywhere. A breath mint clicked against his teeth as he hung up, a nervous habit his wife Nadine had mentioned to Stella once. Laughing about it. He was not laughing that night. He was calculating. Griffin never checked line items. Nadine did not understand them.
And Brent believed that in 6 months, his investments would return triple, and nobody would notice the gap in the books. You are doing the math right now. Nearly $1.5 million. That is what Brent Prescott stole from a resort that was already sitting on land it did not rightfully own, using a company named after the ridgeline his father-in-law built with his bare hands. Cyrus spread the ridgeline capital printouts across my motel bed that evening, the radiator ticking and hissing behind us. He had pulled corporate filings, tax records, anything publicly available. No assets, no employees, no filings beyond a P.O. box in Allentown. Cyrus said, tapping the incorporation document. It's a funnel, not a company. I picked up the printout. The registered agent was a paralegal in Bethlehem I had never heard of. The formation date was 11 months ago, right around the time Griffin and Simone had started their renovation push. So Brent's stealing from my children while they steal from me, I said. There's a symmetry I wish I could appreciate. Cyrus did not smile. Don't stop him. Every dollar he moves is when the trust activates, those transactions become our ammunition. Let him keep loading the gun. Strategic restraint. That was the phrase Cyrus used, and I held on to it the way a man holds onto a rope in dark water. Let them destroy each other. Let the evidence accumulate. But there was a part of me that wanted to drive to the lodge that night and drag Brent out of that finance office by his collar. Brent was a parasite, feeding on a host that was already dead. He just had not noticed the heartbeat had stopped. The next morning, while Brent slept in the suite he had furnished with my wife's money, a woman named Janet Tierney sat down at the same desk he had used the night before. Janet was the lodge's staff accountant, a meticulous woman in her mid-40s who reconciled every ledger twice and trusted numbers more than people. She had worked at the lodge for 9 years, hired by Lorraine, and she noticed things. The wire transfer appeared in her morning reconciliation. She cross-referenced it with the previous 3 transfers to the same entity. No corresponding vendor contracts. No purchase orders, no board approval. 4 transactions, same company, same pattern. She opened a small leather notebook she kept in the lining of her purse, hand-ruled columns, blue ink, dates on the left and dollar amounts on the right. She had started it 2 months ago when the second transfer caught her eye. Now she added the 4th entry, her pen scratching quietly in the empty office. Too afraid of Brent to report it. Too careful to ignore it. She closed the notebook, tucked it back into her purse, and said nothing to anyone. The next afternoon, Stella called me. She had been sorting through the copies she took from the personnel safe payroll records, vendor contracts, internal memos. At the bottom of the stack, she had found something that made her voice shake. A handwritten letter from Simone to Brent, dated 8 months before Lorraine died, discussing how to accelerate the timeline on what they called the succession plan. Stella's voice cracked when she read me the letter. Simone had written to Brent about accelerating something they called the succession plan, dated 8 months before Lorraine died. My wife was still alive when they started. I let that truth settle like a stone in still water. Then I got dressed for work. I put on another man's coveralls, clipped a badge that said Ray to my chest, and walked into the building I had designed 40 years ago like I had never seen it before. Stella had arranged the placement through a temp agency before her termination. The service entrance still used the same keypad code from 2019. I stepped into the utility corridor and the smell hit me. Machine oil and copper. The scent of a geothermal system running the way it should. My system. The new staff did not recognize me. A young maintenance worker nodded as I passed the electrical panel. You know your way around these pipes pretty good for a temp. Ray, he said. I told him I had worked on similar systems and kept walking. The pump room door was unlocked. Inside, the geothermal valves sat exactly where I had installed them in 1983. 40 years and not a single fitting had moved. Circulation gauges normal. Heat exchange coils clean. Pressure differential steady at 14 psi.
My son had inherited a machine he could not even find, and it was still running because I had built it to outlast everyone in this family. I photographed every gauge, every junction label, every valve position. Cyrus needed proof the infrastructure was intact before the Conservation Trust could claim it. This was not nostalgia. This was reconnaissance. I designed every pipe in that building. I poured the pump room floor on a Saturday in August while Lorraine handed me lemonade through the window. And now I was wearing a dead man's name tag so my own son would not throw me out. I was crouched beside the main junction box when Griffin's voice reached me from the corridor. Polished shoes on concrete, cologne cutting through machine oil. He was walking 2 new managers through the facility, pointing at things he could not name. He stopped when he saw me. Recognition crossed his face like a shadow. Then contempt replaced it. "Everyone, meet my father," Griffin said loud enough to echo. He gestured at my coveralls, the wrench in my hand. "He built the pipes. That's about all he ever built. Mom did the rest, and now he's back where he started, fixing leaks." The managers laughed, the way employees laugh when their boss makes a joke they do not find funny. Short, nervous, eyes on the floor. Griffin leaned close. "Sign the waiver, Dad, before this gets any more embarrassing for both of us." I held the wrench steady. The metallic taste in my mouth was every word I wanted to say, and did not. "The valve on line 3 needs a new gasket," I said. "You should have someone look at it." Griffin laughed, shook his head, and walked his managers toward the lobby. His footsteps faded. The corridor went quiet except for the hum of pumps behind the walls. Then a storage door creaked open 6 feet behind me. Wren stood in the doorway in her school hoodie, phone raised, tears running down both cheeks without making a sound. She had come to find me and arrived in time to witness everything. 16 years old, and she had already learned to cry silently. No child should have to learn that. "I recorded it," she whispered. "All of it. Grandpa, I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry," I said. "Be ready." I squeezed her shoulder once through the hoodie. She nodded. I walked back toward the pump room without another word. Because if I stayed, I would have broken in front of her, and she was carrying enough weight for both of us. Lorraine would have been proud of that girl. Lorraine would have been furious at what made her this strong. That night at Pine Ridge Inn, I reviewed the geothermal photographs on my phone. Every gauge read exactly the way it should. 4 years later, my system was still holding. The next evening, Wren called me. She pressed herself flat against the linen closet wall outside Griffin's study, held her breath, and hit record for the 3rd time that week. Except this time, her father was about to confess to a felony. Through the study door, she captured everything. Griffin's voice was raised, panicked, the words tumbling out faster than his judgment could catch them. He told Simone he had pulled the Conservation Trust references off the water rights documents and redated the ownership certificates. He had done it at his dead mother's desk, using her files, rewriting them so Dale Fenton's title verification would come back clean. I pulled the trust references off the water rights docs and redated the certificates. Griffin said, "Fenton won't know the difference. He's a loan officer, not a detective. You forged state heritage documents." "Griffin," Simone said. Her voice was low, controlled, the opposite of his. "If this goes wrong, it won't go wrong if we move fast. I need to bring in an outside attorney to make sure the filing holds up. Let me be clear about what my son did. He did not bend a rule or cut a corner. He sat at his dead mother's desk, opened her files, and rewrote them to steal what she had built. That is not ambition. That is forgery." And his 16-year-old daughter was standing 8 feet away in a linen closet that smelled like fabric softener, recording every word on a phone slippery with sweat. Simone's response surprised even me. She did not argue about the forgery. She argued about the lawyer. "No lawyers," she said. "We can't afford the scrutiny right now. The financials aren't clean enough for outside eyes. Griffin stopped pacing. I could hear it on the recording. The footsteps ceased. What do you mean they aren't clean? Brent handles the books. Exactly. Brent handles the books. Leave it at that. She knew. Simone knew about every dollar Brent had funneled through Ridgeline Capital, and she was not protecting her husband. She was protecting her brother-in-law's theft because their fates were knotted together. An outside attorney conducting due diligence would find the diversions in a week. Simone could not afford Griffin's desperation leading to Brent's exposure. Because if Brent went down, the financial structure holding up their entire takeover would collapse. My daughter-in-law was not an accessory after the fact. She had been complicit from the beginning. Before I tell you what Ren did next, are you still with me? Comment whether you think Ren should send that recording or protect her father. And tell me why in a few words. A quick note, some details ahead are dramatized to convey the emotional weight of this moment. The lesson behind it is what matters. Ren retreated to her bedroom. She locked the door, sat on the edge of her bed, and stared at the ceiling. She was 16. She should have been worrying about chemistry exams and whether her friends would text back. Instead, she was sitting in the dark, deciding whether to send a recording that would put her father in prison. She typed Vernon's private email address into the recipient field. Subject line, Dad forged the documents. Her thumb hovered over send. Bile rose in her throat. She pressed it. At Pine Ridge Inn. I opened the email on my phone. The audio file was 11 minutes long. I listened to every second. Sitting motionless on the motel bed with the radiator clicking behind me. My son forged documents. My daughter-in-law was covering for her brother-in-law's theft. And my 16-year-old granddaughter was the only honest person left in that building. I forwarded the file to Cyrus without adding a single word. There was nothing to add. He called back within 20 minutes. His voice was different. Not the careful lawyer tone I had come to rely on, but something harder. Something that sounded like alarm. I've listened to the recording 3 times, Cyrus said. Griffin didn't just forge the documents. He mentioned a second set of originals he found in the wine cellar, in a room he described as some kind of bunker. He's been inside the hidden chamber, and he took something out. Griffin had found the hidden chamber beneath the wine cellar. He had never found the steel door, and he never had the key. He had found a second way, in a maintenance hatch behind the wine racks that I had sealed with drywall back in 1998, and forgotten existed until Cyrus mentioned the dust disturbed on its hinges. Through it, he had gone inside and taken documents out. Cyrus delivered that news with the tone of a man reading a death certificate. And I drove to Pine Ridge Inn at midnight to figure out what was left. But before I could act, the bank acted first. The phone rang at 8:47 a.m., and my son's empire ended before he finished saying hello. I was not in the room when Dale Fenton called, but Ren was close enough to hear the speakerphone through the office door. And she told me everything that evening, in a voice so flat it frightened me. Griffin had been sitting at the executive desk with Nadine beside him, waiting for the title verification results like a patient waiting on a biopsy. The speaker light blinked red. Fenton's voice was measured, professional. The kind of calm that only sounds calm because the person delivering the news has no stake in it. Every subsurface right, water easement, and access road associated with the property had transferred to a conservation trust on the exact date the stone wall came down. Griffin did not hold clear title to collateralize. All loan activity was frozen. That's impossible, Griffin said. We inherited everything. The will was clear. Fenton explained that the will distributed operating rights. The underlying assets were governed by a separate instrument, a heritage preservation clause embedded in the original deed. Griffin had never read the original deed. He had demolished the wall that triggered the clause, celebrated the demolition on camera, and submitted forged documents to a bank that had now discovered the truth without needing them. Frozen. Every dollar, every plan, every champagne toast and condo rendering frozen by a clause buried in a wall they tore down in front of journalists. You cannot write irony that clean. Griffin hung up and turned to Nadine and Brent, who had been listening from the leather chairs by the window. Nadine was white-faced, reaching for a glass of water and missing it. Brent said nothing. His silence was practiced. Deliberate, the silence of a man who had known this was coming for weeks. The argument started immediately. "You knew the water rights were flagged and you said nothing," Griffin said to Nadine, his hands shaking against the desk edge. "I thought it was a filing mistake," Nadine said. "The county clerk mentioned it weeks ago. How was I supposed to know Mom set up some kind of trust?" Weeks ago. Nadine had received a warning from the county clerk and dismissed it as a clerical error. She had not mentioned it to Griffin, had not asked a lawyer, had not even written it down. She had folded it into the same mental drawer where she kept every inconvenient truth. The drawer marked, "Not my problem." Brent watched them argue from his chair by the window. He had his phone angled slightly away from the others, screen tilted toward his chest. When Griffin turned on him, demanding to know why the financials had not flagged the trust, Brent answered too quietly. "The question isn't who set it up. The question is who controls it now." Griffin was tearing that office apart like a man searching for a fire exit in a building that had already burned down. Filing cabinet drawers slammed open. Papers flew across the carpet. He pulled every folder Stella had not already taken, crushed documents in his fists, and found nothing, because the documents he had taken from the hidden chamber were copies that did not name a trustee. The original designation was somewhere else entirely, and he would never find it by screaming. But he screamed anyway. "Who controls that trust?" Griffin shouted, loud enough that the sound carried through the corridor and reached the front desk. "Somebody in this family knows and nobody is telling me." Nadine looked at the floor. "What if it's Dad?" Griffin stopped. Cold sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. A forgotten champagne glass sat on the desk from some celebration that now felt like it belonged to another century. "Dad is living in a motel room and fixing pipes for minimum wage," Griffin said. "He doesn't control anything." Brent said nothing. He already knew the answer. He had known it since the night he found the trust filings on the county website and chose silence over warning. He was not going to save Griffin. He was going to save himself. "I was sitting at Pine Ridge Inn when Wren texted me a photograph. She had taken it through the office doorway during the meltdown, papers everywhere. Nadine crying. Brent by the window with his phone angled away. Wren had zoomed in on his screen. He was drafting an email to Cyrus Whitaker's firm. The subject line read, "Private inquiry, immunity in exchange for cooperation." Wren's photograph arrived while I was still processing the bank's verdict. Brent's screen zoomed in clear an email draft to Cyrus offering cooperation for immunity. My son-in-law was already negotiating his escape before the smoke had finished rising. I forwarded the image to Cyrus and waited. "Have you ever watched 4 people drown in a room with no water?" Griffin called an emergency meeting in the lodge lobby that afternoon. Nadine, Simone and Brent gathered around the reception desk like survivors on a lifeboat. And they were still arguing about who had steered them into the iceberg when Stella walked through the front door. Nobody had invited her. She came anyway. "I brought Griffin the preservation clause documents 10 days ago," Stella said, standing in the middle of the lobby with her coat still on. "He told me to shut up and get out. So I did, and I took copies of everything on my way." Simone turned on Griffin with a fury I had never heard from her. Not even during the worst of the renovation arguments. "You fired the one person who tried to save us. You fired her, and then you forged documents instead of listening." "She's the help." "Simone," Griffin said. "Since when do we take legal advice from hotel managers?" Griffin called Stella the help. 22 years she had kept that lodge running through blizzards and kitchen fires and budget shortfalls. And to my son, she was the help. Lorraine would have slapped him across the mouth. The lobby fractured. Simone blamed Griffin. Nadine blamed Simone for not supervising the finances. Griffin blamed everyone for not catching the trust clause earlier. Brent stood apart from the wreckage, quiet, patient, waiting for exactly this moment. When the shouting peaked, Brent produced a business card from his jacket pocket. "I have someone," he said. "Private capital. No title verification needed. He can move funds within 48 hours, but he wants all four of us in the room tonight." Griffin stared at the card. "Who is this person?" "Someone who doesn't ask questions." Which is exactly what we need right now. Nobody asked how Brent had arranged a private investor so quickly. Nobody asked why the meeting had to happen that same night. Nobody asked because they were drowning and Brent was holding out a rope. And drowning people do not inspect the rope. They drove to Allentown at 9 p.m. to sign a contract with a man they had never met, in a building with no sign on the door. Because a brother-in-law who was already stealing from them said it was their only option. And not one of them paused to ask why. The office sat in an industrial district off Hamilton Street. Diesel and wet concrete. No receptionist, no artwork on the walls. Fluorescent lighting that hummed at a frequency designed to make people want to leave. A single desk, 4 chairs. And behind the desk, a man named Mr. Vance. Mr. Vance was a gray-suited man of about 50 who spoke in complete sentences, never smiled, and represented interests he did not name. His briefcase was unmarked. He opened it, laid a 30-page contract on the desk, and placed 4 cheap ballpoint pens beside it. "Sign on pages 12, 19, and 27, he said. "Initial the resource disclosure on page 14. All 4 signatures required on each page." Nadine reached for the contract. "Can we take a copy to review with our—" "The terms are non-negotiable and time-sensitive. You sign tonight, or the offer expires at midnight." They signed. 4 pens scratching across slightly damp contract paper in a cold room that smelled of stale air and desperation. Griffin signed first, then Nadine, then Simone. Brent signed last, and he was the only one whose hand did not shake. Gas station coffee sat untouched in paper cups on the corner of the desk. Mr. Vance collected all 4 copies, placed them in his briefcase, shook no hands, and left through a rear door without a word. On the drive back, Cyrus sent me a scan of every signed page. I sat on the motel bed and read them under the lamp while the radiator clicked. Page 14. The resource disclosure contained a single paragraph my children had initialed without reading. The signatories acknowledged that the assets referenced were subject to unresolved ownership claims and that no independent legal review had been conducted prior to the execution. 4 initials, 4 confessions, and in the margin of Cyrus's copy, in pencil, in handwriting I would have recognized across a crowded room, was a note dated 3 years earlier. Lorraine had written it herself. "They will sign anything if they are scared enough." Lorraine knew them better than I did. She had written that note 3 years before she died. Sitting at the same desk where Cyrus now spread the signed confessions like a hand of cards. They will sign anything if they are scared enough. My wife had built the trap. I was just the one pulling the wire. 3 black SUVs pulled into the lodge parking lot at 7:15 a.m. And my son's last morning as a resort owner began with a knock he was not expecting. The lead inspector was a tall woman named Meredith Dunlap, Heritage Preservation Division, who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke in statute numbers the way other people spoke in sentences. She arrived with 3 colleagues in Navy windbreakers carrying seal stamps and inventory binders. They presented Griffin and Nadine with a sealed preservation order issued through the Conservation Trust My Trust, requiring all operational records related to water, people, occupation, land use, and geothermal access to be preserved and inventoried immediately. "Mr. Caldwell, this is a preservation order under Section 12 of the Pennsylvania Heritage Conservation Act," Meredith said, placing the document on the executive desk. "All records pertaining to water, land, and subsurface resource use are to be sealed.
Interference constitutes a misdemeanor of the second degree. Griffin stood behind the desk with his hands flat on the surface. This is my resort. You can't walk in here and... The trust that owns the land beneath your resort disagrees, Meredith said. Please step away from the filing cabinets. The inspectors moved through that office the way water moves through a cracked foundation. Steady, inevitable, and impossible to push back once it starts. They opened every drawer, photographed every ledger, and sealed boxes with tamper-evident tape, while Griffin watched with his jaw clenched and Nadine stood by the window gripping her elbows. Griffin had no legal standing to refuse. The trust owned the underlying assets, the preservation order was statutory, and the man who controlled that trust was sitting in a motel room 11 miles away, drinking coffee and waiting, while the inspectors worked through the executive office. Griffin caught Simone's eye. One look, that was all it took. They retreated to the back office with armfuls of files and closed the door. The shredder started immediately. I did not see it happen, but Meredith's team noted the sound in their report, and Wren confirmed it later. Simone fed documents through as fast as the machine would take them. Financial records, the forged certificates, vendor contracts that would connect Brent to his shell company. Griffin stood beside her, pulling staples and flattening folders. Everything with ridgeline on it, Simone said. Everything with the water rights, everything Stella could have copied, all of it, now. What about the Allentown contract? Griffin asked. Vance has the only copies. We never kept one, just shred and pray. They were shredding evidence of crimes committed inside a building powered by systems they no longer owned, on land that belonged to the father they had evicted. Every second that shredder ran, it was running on stolen electricity, and they did not even realize it. The shredder jammed. A thick folder caught in the teeth of the original Heritage Registry certificates Simone had stripped from the auction items weeks earlier. The brass plaques Lorraine had mounted with a Phillips head screwdriver. Their paper records. Now half-eaten by a machine that had choked on the weight of what it was being asked to destroy. Griffin knelt and pulled at the jammed paper. The motor whined, and the smell of burning filled the room. Then the lights flickered and died. The entire lodge went dark. The hum of the geothermal pumps that had been running beneath the floors for 40 years stopped. The heating vents went silent. Cold mountain air began creeping through the walls immediately, and the temperature in the back office dropped fast enough that Simone's breath became visible in the glow of Griffin's phone screen. The geothermal, Simone whispered. The geothermal runs the power. Griffin, they own the geothermal. I had sent Cyrus a 2-word text from Pine Ridge Inn 10 minutes earlier. Cut the heat. He had forwarded it to Meredith's team, who had forwarded it to the Utility Compliance Office, who had executed the shutdown with a single command. My system, my design, my switch. In the sudden darkness, Griffin's phone lit up. One notification. A text from a number he did not recognize. The mountain remembers who built it. No signature. Just the letter V. He stared at the screen while Simone's breathing turned ragged beside him. Outside the window, the inspectors were loading sealed boxes into the black SUVs. Working by flashlight, unbothered by the blackout they had clearly expected. 12 hours after the blackout, Griffin called a press conference in the lodge lobby, determined to spin the chaos into a story he could still control. That was his first mistake of the day. It was not last. Griffin had 12 minutes of prepared remarks, a freshly pressed suit, and a podium microphone. And none of it mattered after the lobby doors opened. He stood behind the podium in the lodge lobby, addressing a room of regional journalists and 2 television crews. The backup generator powered the lights, but the heating was still dead, and every breath in the room carried a faint cloud. Griffin did not acknowledge the cold. He called it proactive restructuring. He called the heritage inspection routine compliance. He called the power outage a scheduled maintenance upgrade. The Caldwell Mountain Lodge is entering its most exciting chapter, he said,
gripping the podium edges with both hands.
What you are witnessing is not a crisis, but transformation. Nadine stood beside him, nodding, her arms crossed against the chill, performing confidence neither of them possessed. A journalist in the second row raised her hand. Mr. Caldwell, can you comment on the heritage preservation order filed against this property? Griffin smiled the way a man smiles when his teeth are the only thing holding his face together. We welcome the state's interest in our heritage. It confirms the value of what we are building. Picture it. My son at a podium, lying to cameras about a building he did not own, on land he did not hold. Powered by systems someone else had switched off. And he was still talking about legacy. I waited until his 11th minute. The lobby doors opened at 2:47 p.m. I know the exact time because 3 cameras time-stamped it. I walked through those doors wearing a tailored charcoal suit I had picked up from a shop in Easton 2 days earlier. Cyrus Whitaker was on my left, in a 3-piece, carrying a leather portfolio that held every piece of evidence we had gathered since January. Murray Holbrook was on my right with a blueprint tube under his arm containing the original geothermal schematics, the ones that proved I designed every system keeping that building alive. Stella Garrett followed 2 steps behind him, wearing the same blazer she had worn on her last day as lodge manager. The room pivoted. Not gradually, not politely. Every camera turned the way a flock of birds changes direction all at once. All together, as if responding to a signal nobody heard. Griffin's prepared remarks died in his throat. I stopped 15 feet from the podium and stood still, hands clasped in front of me. I did not speak. I did not need to. The cameras were already firing shutter clicks, erupting like applause in a language Griffin could not understand. A journalist turned to her cameraman. "That's the father! Get him now!" Stella leaned toward a former colleague on staff near the service door. "Tell the kitchen to put coffee on," she said quietly. "This is going to take a while." Every camera had turned. Every single one. In 3 seconds, my son went from the man at the microphone to the man nobody was looking at. That is what power looks like when it changes hands. It does not announce itself. It just walks through the door. Griffin leaned into the microphone. His voice cracked on the first syllable. "This press conference is not over. I am still speaking." But he was speaking to the backs of heads. The journalists had surged toward me, recorders raised, questions overlapping. Nadine reached for Griffin's arm, and he shook her off, his knuckles white on the podium wood, sweat darkening his collar despite the cold that had settled into the lobby overnight. For the first time, my son looked at me and did not see a defeated old man in borrowed coveralls. He saw something he had never considered possible. He saw patience. He saw the man who poured the foundation, wired the circuits, laid the pipes, married the woman who gave this mountain its name, standing in a suit that fit like it had been waiting for this moment, flanked by people who had chosen the right side. I walked forward. The journalists parted. I stopped within arm's length of the podium and looked at my son the way you look at a door you are about to open for the last time. I reached into my jacket, pulled out a single folded document, and set it on the podium between his hands. His eyes dropped to the header. Caldwell Heritage Conservation Trust. Sole trustee, Vernon J. Caldwell. The camera shutters were the only sound in the room. My son read his own name on that trust document and looked up at me, with the expression of a boy who just realized the locked door was never locked. It was just waiting for him to push. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The cameras caught every second of it, and I stood there watching my child understand that the father he had dismissed, humiliated, and evicted had been holding the keys the entire time. Cyrus stepped to the podium. He set a crimson leather folder on the surface. He opened it and began to read. His voice carried the way good legal language carries slow, measured, impossible to interrupt. He read the Heritage Preservation Clause in full.
explaining that the demolition of the historic stone wall triggered an automatic and irrevocable transfer of all exploitation rights to the Conservation Trust. Water rights, land deeds, mountain access road, geothermal patents. Every asset that made the lodge viable had moved to an entity controlled by one person. He did not say my name. He did not need to. The trust document was still sitting on the podium between Griffin's white knuckles. Murray stepped forward next, unrolling the original geothermal blueprints under the camera lights. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the notarized dates were clear. He testified that he had co-designed the system in 1983, and that every patent predated the resort's incorporation by 3 years. The infrastructure was mine before the lodge existed. It was mine again now. Do you know what it sounds like when a lawyer reads your children's confession to a room full of journalists? It sounds like the truth. And the truth has a very specific rhythm, slow, measured, and impossible to interrupt. Cyrus produced the Allentown contract. The room shifted. Brent, who had been standing near the service corridor with his arms crossed, took a step forward. Griffin's grip on the podium tightened. Nadine looked at the floor. Cyrus turned to page 14 and read the resource disclosure clause aloud. The signatories acknowledged that the assets referenced were subject to unresolved ownership claims. No independent legal review had been conducted prior to execution. 4 initials on each page. 4 adults who had signed a document in a cold Allentown office without reading it because they were scared and desperate, and a man in a gray suit told them midnight was the deadline. "This is not an investment contract," Cyrus said, closing the folder. "It is a signed confession." He set a leather notebook beside the contract, Janet Tierney's ledger, of 4 wire transfers to Ridgeline Capital. "Fraud has a paper trail," Cyrus said. "This is Brent's." Brent grabbed the nearest copy of the page from the podium. His fingers trembled as he scanned the fine print for the first time. The color left his face in stages. First the cheeks, then the lips, then the skin around his eyes, until he looked like a man standing in a morgue rather than a hotel lobby. "You told me this was a bridge loan," Brent said to Griffin. "You said Vance was a private investor." "I didn't read the fine print either." "Brent," Griffin said. "None of us did." That was when Simone made her move. She stepped away from Griffin. Physically. 2 steps to the left, angling her body toward the cameras, distancing herself from her husband the way a passenger distances herself from a sinking ship. She smoothed her jacket. She lifted her chin. Simone pointed at her own husband on live television and said she knew nothing. The woman who told Griffin to shred the documents. The woman who blocked him from hiring lawyers to protect Brent's diversions. The woman whose handwritten letter discussed accelerating the succession plan while Lorraine was still alive. She pointed at him, and she lied. "I knew nothing about the forged documents," Simone said, looking directly into the nearest camera. "My husband made these decisions without consulting me. I am a victim of his recklessness, not participant," Nadine whispered from behind her. "Simone, stop. You're making it worse." I let her speak. Every word she said on camera was another lie that Wren's recording would contradict. I had the audio of Simone telling Griffin to shred everything. I had her voice blocking outside counsel. I had her own words proving complicity, and now I had her televised denial to play against them. She was building my case with every sentence. Griffin turned from Simone to me. The cameras caught the exact moment, his jaw set, his fists clenched at his sides. His eyes were wet for the first time since his mother's funeral. He took 1 step toward me and stopped. "Did Mom know?" he said. Quietly enough that only I should have heard it, but every microphone in that room picked it up. "Did she plan all of this?" I opened my mouth to answer, and I couldn't. Because the honest answer was yes. And the salt I swallowed back was not anger. It was grief. I could not answer Griffin's question because the truth would have broken him worse than the trust document. Yes, his mother planned it. She planned it because she loved him. and she saw what he was becoming, and she could not stop it any other way. I swallowed that answer and said nothing, and my silence filled the lobby like smoke. Griffin's response came not as words, but as a fist slamming the podium and a scream that silenced every camera in the room. Security. 2 lodge guards entered from the service corridor, young men in navy blazers who had been hired after Stella's termination and had never met the man standing at the center of the lobby. Griffin pointed at me.
Get him out! This is my property! Remove this man now!
Cyrus stepped forward before either guard moved. He held up the trust document, turned it so both men could read the header, and spoke with the precision of a surgeon, explaining why the operation could not proceed. This document establishes Vernon Caldwell as sole owner of the land beneath this structure, the water supply, and all access routes. Removing him would constitute trespass against the legal property owner. I advise you to stand down. The senior guard read the document. He looked at Griffin. He looked at me. Then he stepped back. The guard stepped back the way men step back from a building they know is about to come down. Slowly, carefully, making sure nothing falls on them. They had picked the right side. My son had not. "I'm sorry, Mr. Caldwell," the senior guard said to Griffin. "We can't do that." Griffin's last tool of authority had just refused to obey him. He had no bank, no title, no power, no security, and every camera in the room was recording the exact moment he realized it. The collapse came fast. Nadine turned on Griffin first. Her mascara was streaking, and her voice carried the raw edge of a woman who had spent weeks ignoring warnings and was now paying the full price for every one of them.
You did this, she said. You tore down that wall. You forged the documents. You destroyed everything Mom built, and you dragged us down with you.
Simone stepped forward next, but not toward Griffin, toward the cameras. Her posture was rigid, rehearsed. The stance of a woman who had calculated her exit while everyone else was still screaming. "I am filing for divorce by the end of this week," Simone said. "My attorney will be in contact. I will not go to prison for your incompetence, Griffin." The lobby went quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then Brent spoke. "And I'm filing too," he said to Nadine. His voice was flat, emptied of everything except arithmetic. This marriage was a business arrangement, and the business just went bankrupt. 2 marriages dissolved in the same room in under a minute. On camera, before journalists who were already writing the headlines. The 4 people who had divided a mountain were now dividing themselves, and there was nothing left to split except blame. I raised those children. I taught Griffin to ride a bike in this lodge's parking lot. I walked Nadine down the aisle in the garden behind the east wing. And now I was watching them destroy each other in the lobby where their mother hung Christmas lights every November. I buttoned my suit jacket. I nodded once to Cyrus, once to Murray, and I walked toward the lobby doors. A journalist shouted behind me, "Mr. Caldwell Vernon, do you have anything to say to your children?" I did not turn around. I did not stop. I gave the cameras nothing, no triumph, no tears, no comment. The last thing the press captured was my back disappearing through the doors while my family screamed behind me. "Lorraine, I did what you asked. I protected the mountain, but I could not protect them from themselves. And I would carry that out the door with me for the rest of my life." I made it to the parking lot before my knees gave out. Murray caught me by the elbow and held me against the side of his truck while I pressed my forehead to the cold metal and breathed. The mountain air hit my face, and I tasted salt tears I had swallowed through every revelation, every confrontation, every silence that cost me more than speaking ever would have. My shoulders shook beneath the suit fabric, and I let them. Behind us, through the lobby windows. Cameras were still flashing. Cyrus stood beside me for a long time without speaking. Then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. "Lorraine left one more," he said. "The last one. It is addressed to Griffin. She asked that you deliver it yourself."
I held Lorraine's last envelope in my hands for 3 days before I opened it. 3 days in the Pine Ridge Inn, sitting on the edge of a motel bed, turned the cream-colored stationery over and over while the radiator clicked and the mountain fog pressed against the window. I knew her handwriting the way I knew my own heartbeat, and I was afraid of what it would say. I spent 3 days reading Lorraine's last letter before I could stand up straight enough to do what came next. The letter was addressed to Griffin, but written for me to read first. Lorraine had dated it 18 months before she died. In the careful blue ink she used for everything important, she explained what she had built and why. Not revenge. Not punishment. A lesson. Vernon. If you are reading this, then our son did exactly what I prayed he would not. She had known. She had watched Griffin drifting towards Simone's ambitions for years. Had seen the greed forming the way a farmer sees a storm building on the horizon. Too far away to stop, close enough to prepare for. She had filed the preservation clause, hired Cyrus, structured the trust, and written this letter as the last piece of a plan designed to let Griffin fail so completely that he would have no choice but to rebuild from the ground. I loved him enough to let him fail, she wrote. I need you to love him enough to let him fall. Then catch him, but only once. Lorraine wrote that letter knowing she would be dead when it was read. She wrote it in handwriting I had loved for 47 years. On stationery she kept in the desk I built her. And she signed it the way she signed everything, with a small L inside a circle. Love. Even this was love. I blinked salt from my eyes and folded the letter back into its envelope. Then I called Cyrus. We arrived at the lodge the next morning. The parking lot was empty, except for Griffin's sedan and Nadine's SUV. The lobby was cold. The geothermal system was still shut down, and nobody had ordered fuel for the backup generator. Griffin and Nadine were sitting in the lobby in winter coats, waiting for something they could not name. Cyrus placed the eviction notice on the reception desk. He had formatted it deliberately. Same font, same legal phrasing, same cold structure Griffin had used when he handed me a suitcase and pointed at the door 3 weeks earlier. This is a formal notice of eviction under the authority of the Caldwell Heritage Conservation Trust, Cyrus said. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises with personal belongings only. All lodge property remains on site. Griffin picked up the document. His hands were steady, but his voice was not. Where are we supposed to go? You want to know what revenge tastes like? It tastes like nothing. It tastes like handing your son an eviction notice in the same lobby where you taught him to walk, using the same words he used on you, and feeling absolutely no satisfaction. Zero. Just the sound of a door you wish you did not have to close. When you handed me a suitcase and told me to leave, I said, "You never asked me that question. I'm returning the courtesy." Griffin set the notice down. He did not argue. He did not shout. Whatever fight had been left in him after the press conference and the divorces and the public collapse, it gone. He looked like a man standing in the wreckage of a house he had burned down himself. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the snowflake key. It was still cracked along the top edge, still cold between my fingers, still carrying the weight of every night I had held it in the motel room, wondering whether I would ever see this lodge again. I set it on the lobby table. The wood grain received it without a sound. I placed Lorraine's sealed letter beside it. Your mother wanted you to have this back, I said. And the letter. Read it when you are ready, not before. Nadine stepped forward. Dad, please. I did not turn around. The door closed behind me. I was halfway across the parking lot, spring mountain air filling my lungs for the first time in weeks, when I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. Not Griffin, not Nadine. Wren. She was carrying a backpack and her school jacket, straps pulled tight on her shoulders. She stopped 3 feet from me with her chin up and her eyes dry. I'm not staying with him, she said. Grandma would have wanted me with you, and I have something you need to hear.
Something about Mom and Uncle Brent that nobody else knows. Wren told me everything on the drive back to Pine Ridge Inn. Simone and Brent had been meeting privately for over a year before Lorraine died. Not romantically, but strategically. Coordinating the financial structure that would let them strip the lodge once Griffin took over. Wren had overheard them through her bedroom wall. She was 16 and she had been carrying that weight alone. I put my hand on her shoulder and told her she would never have to carry it alone again. The repo trucks came on a Tuesday morning, and my son watched his Mercedes get winched onto a flatbed while wearing the same bathrobe he had slept in for 3 days. I was not there. Stella told me. She had driven past the lodge on her way to a job interview in Stroudsburg and saw Griffin standing in the driveway, unshaven, barefoot on the cold asphalt, watching a driver in a yellow vest hook chains to the undercarriage of a car worth more than most people's houses. "That car is worth $90,000, Griffin told the driver. "You can't just—" "Sir, I have a court order. Please step back from the vehicle." Nadine stood in the doorway behind him. She was still dressed, still upright, still holding herself together in the way women hold themselves together when everything around them is falling apart. "Let it go. Griffin," she said. "It's a car. We've lost things that matter more than cars." The credit lines were canceled the same day. Corporate accounts frozen. The bank that had refused to lend against the property was now clawing back every personal guarantee Griffin and Nadine had signed during the months of expansion planning. They had divided a mountain between them and ended up with nothing but dust. The cars, the credit lines, the corner offices all towed or frozen or repossessed, piece by piece, until what remained was 2 people in a driveway with nowhere to drive. Simone arrived 3 days later in a taxi. She did not come inside. She rolled the window down, handed Griffin a manila envelope, and told him her attorney would handle the rest. Griffin held the divorce papers and stared at the woman who had pushed him toward every decision that brought them here. "Simone, Wren is gone," he said. "She left. Don't you even want to know where your daughter—" "Wren made her choice," Simone said. "I'm making mine." The taxi pulled away down the mountain road. Simone did not look back. She did not glance at Wren's empty bedroom window. She did not ask a single question about the girl she had raised for 16 years. She was fleeing criminal exposure before investigators could compel her testimony, and her daughter was simply not part of the calculation. I had suspected Simone was capable of ruthlessness. I had not understood it was bottomless. Griffin stood in the driveway, holding the envelope until the taxi disappeared around the bend. Then he went inside and closed the door. Nadine's ending was quieter. She and Brent had moved into a small rental apartment in the valley after the eviction. 2 bedrooms, fresh paint. The kind of place that smells like cleaning chemicals and nobody's history. Nadine came home from a meeting with a public defender to find Brent's closet empty. Hangers swinging on the rod. His shoes gone, his laptop gone. Divorce papers on the kitchen counter with a post-it note stuck to the top page. "I'm sorry. Survival." Do you know the exact moment a person stops being angry and starts being sorry? It is the moment they sit on a cold floor in an empty apartment and realize no one is coming to help them. Because they never helped anyone either. Nadine sat on that floor with her back against the wall and her knees pulled to her chest. The apartment was silent. No geothermal hum. No lodge staff moving through corridors. No Brent. No Griffin. No Wren. No mother. Just bare walls and the smell of fresh paint. And the understanding, arriving years too late, of what she had done to me. I sat in a motel room that smelled like pine soap in someone else's life. Now she was sitting in a room that smelled like nothing at all. And she finally understood. We gave him a suitcase. We did not even ask where he would sleep. Her phone buzzed on the bare floor beside her. A text from a number she had deleted but still recognized. 2 words. "Call me." She stared at it for 20 minutes. I know because when she finally dialed, her voice was raw, and she told me she had been sitting there staring since the screen first lit up. She did not know if she had the right to call. I answered on the first ring. I had been waiting. Nadine said hello and then said nothing for almost a minute. I listened to her breathe. When the words finally came, they were small and stripped of every pretense she had ever worn. She said she was sorry. She said she understood now. I told her I knew, and that we would talk soon. Then I hung up and sat with Ren in the motel room, watching the mountain turn gray through the window. What happens to people when the world decides they no longer exist? Griffin found out. He sat in the borrowed apartment calling every investor, business partner, and social contact in his phone. Every call went to voicemail. Every text went unanswered. The footage from the press conference lived online, and everyone he had ever known had seen it. The podium, the trust document, the cameras turning away from him like a tide pulling out. 47 contacts. Not one callback. He left a message for a man named Marcus who had attended 3 consecutive lodge Christmas parties. I know you've seen the news, but I can explain. Just call me back.
Please.
Marcus never called back. Nobody did. Nadine discovered her real estate license had been suspended pending investigation. The brokerage dropped her the same morning, not with a phone call, not with a meeting, but with an email. 3 sentences and a legal disclaimer. "We are ghosts," Griffin said, staring at his phone in the kitchen of an apartment that smelled like fresh paint and failure. Social death is not loud. It is the quietest thing in the world. It is 47 names on a screen and the understanding that not one of them will ever light up again. That night, after Nadine had fallen asleep on the couch in her clothes, Griffin sat alone at the kitchen table and opened the envelope I had left beside the snowflake key. Lorraine's handwriting filled 2 pages of cream stationery. The blue ink careful and steady. The kind of penmanship that belongs to a woman who knew exactly what she was saying and how long it would take her husband and her son to hear it. "Griffin, you were the brightest boy I ever knew." She told him the truth, not the legal truth Cyrus had read from the podium, but the harder truth underneath it. Somewhere between the corner office and the champagne. He had forgotten that the people who built things for him were not beneath him. They were the foundation. She had watched him change, and she could not stop it. So she built something that would stop him instead. "I did not build this trap to destroy you. I built it to stop you before you destroyed yourself. If your father delivered this letter, it means he still believes you can be saved. So do I. Come home when you are ready, not to the lodge, but to the man you were supposed to become." He read it twice. The second time he read it aloud, in a whisper, as if she might hear him. When he reached the last line, he folded the paper carefully, put it in his shirt pocket against his chest, and sat in the dark until morning. The next day, Griffin and Nadine packed their remaining clothes into plastic bags. They checked out of the apartment with nowhere to go. The landlord did not wish them well. The parking lot was empty because they no longer had cars to park in it. Nadine looked at the road leading down toward town, and then at the road leading up toward the mountain. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Home," Griffin said. "We don't have a home anymore." "I know, but Dad does." They walked uphill. The April air was cold and sharp in their throats, and the gravel crunched under shoes that were not meant for mountain roads. Nadine limped slightly in flats that had been designed for office carpet. Griffin wore a jacket too thin for the altitude, plastic bag handles cut into their fingers. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say that could be said while walking. The words that mattered could only be spoken standing still, face to face, with nothing between them. I saw them from the lodge kitchen window. 2 figures on the access road, moving uphill in the gray morning light, carrying everything they owned in grocery bags. My son, my daughter. walking toward a gate they used to open with a remote from the driver's seat of a car that no longer existed. They stopped at the gate. They did not ring the bell. They just stood there, breath clouding in the cold, waiting. The way people wait when they know they have no right to ask, but nowhere else to go. Wren came up beside me at the window. She looked out at her father and her aunt standing in the cold.
Are you going to let them in?
She asked. I did not answer yet. I stood at the gate for a long time before I opened it. Not because I did not want to, but because I needed my children to see my face and know that what came next was not forgiveness, not yet, but something harder. A chance they would have to earn. The hinges creaked when I pushed the iron open. Griffin looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and a jacket too thin for the mountain. Nadine stood beside him, gripping plastic bag handles that had cut white lines into her fingers. They looked like the people Lorraine and I had been 40 years ago, and carrying everything they owned in their hands. The difference was that we had been walking toward something. They were walking back from the wreckage of what we built. Griffin spoke first. His voice cracked on the word he never thought he would say to me. Dad, we have nothing. No credit, no contacts, no place to live. Just the stipend, $1,800 a month. The same thing Nadine offered you. We'll sign whatever you want. $1,800. The exact number his sister had once offered me as a parting gift while handing me a suitcase. He was asking for the same charity they had dressed up as generosity the night they threw me out. The mirror was complete. Your mother and I built this lodge with a bank loan we couldn't afford and a pickup truck that broke down twice a week, I said. Nobody gave us a stipend. Nobody opened a gate for us. I know what you are thinking. You are thinking I should have let them in, fed them, given them the money and a warm bed, and maybe you are right. But Lorraine did not build this trap so I could undo it with a checkbook. She built it so our children would learn to build something themselves, or finally understand why they never could. I will not give you money, I said, but I will give you what your mother gave me. A reason to get up in the morning and build something worth keeping. When you are ready for that, come back. Not before. Griffin closed his eyes. Nadine pressed her lips together. Neither argued. Neither begged. Something in the way they stood told me they had expected this, maybe even needed it. Griffin reached into his shirt pocket and touched the folded letter he had been carrying against his chest since the night he read it. Okay, Dad, he said. They turned and walked back down the access road. I watched until they disappeared around the bend. Two figures growing smaller against the gray mountain morning, plastic bags swinging at their sides. Then I closed the gate. Wren was standing on the lodge steps behind me. She had watched the entire exchange. Her eyes were dry. She had learned months ago that crying did not change anything, only choices did. I reached into my pocket and held out the cracked snowflake key. Your grandmother gave me this the night I thought I had lost everything, I said. It turned out to be the most valuable thing anyone ever handed me. Wren looked at the key in my palm. What does it open in? Come with me. I'll show you. I led her through the service elevator, down the frost-covered corridor where the air tasted of old stone and mineral warmth. The geothermal hum grew louder with every step, the mountain's heartbeat rising through the floor. When we reached the steel door, Wren touched it and pulled her hand back. Not from heat, but from recognition. She could feel the mountain breathing through the metal. And for the first time since Lorraine died, I knew the mountain would be all right. Inside the iron bed frame, the original blueprints spread across the desk. Lorraine's handwriting on the wall in pencil. Wren walked the room slowly, touching nothing, reading everything. She stopped beneath the words carved into the stone above the door frame. Words Lorraine had put there decades ago. The mountain remembers who built it. She meant me, Wren said quietly. She meant whoever was brave enough to choose the truth over the easy way, I said. You chose. This is yours now. Wren set the snowflake key on the desk beside the blueprints. Then she picked it up again and hung it on a chain around her neck, where it settled against her collarbone like it had always belonged there. That evening we sat on the lodge porch drinking tea in silence, watching the sun set behind the Blue Ridge, below us. On the access road, two small figures were still walking, not away from the mountain, but toward the town at its base, where Lorraine and I had once rented our first apartment, with borrowed furniture and a dream we could not afford. I did not know if my children would find their way back, but the mountain would be here when they did. It always was. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I spent 40 years building something with my hands and my heart, and I watched my own children try to tear it down in a matter of weeks. I do not tell you this as a revenge story where the hero walks away clean. I tell you this because I made mistakes too. I stayed quiet too long. I trusted that love alone would be enough to keep my family honest. It was not. If you see the cracks forming in your own house, do not wait for the walls to come down before you speak up. This was never about revenge. People will call it a revenge story. And I understand why a father outsmarts his children, takes back what they stole, watches them lose everything. But the truth is harder than that. The real lesson is that the things worth protecting are not buildings or bank accounts. They are the people inside them. I failed to protect my children from themselves, and that is a weight I will carry for the rest of my life. I believe God put me through this so I could stand here and tell you, protect what matters before someone forces you to fight for it. Love your family fiercely, but love them with open eyes. If this revenge story moved you, I would appreciate it if you left a comment and told me what you would have done differently. Would you have opened that gate? Would you have handed them the stipend? Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have not already, subscribe so you do not miss the next story. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Please remember that certain details in this story were dramatized for emotional impact and storytelling purposes.